Opening the center creates immediate scope for your pieces and initiates a dynamic battle for control of the board's core. Embracing the center symmetrically, this response immediately contests white's pawn's dominion, setting the stage for dynamic central play and rapid development. Developing the knight here immediately pressures black's central pawn, forcing a decision about its defense. Challenging white's central pawn immediately, black ignites a tactical dance around the e5 square. Challenging the center directly, white invites immediate confrontation and opens lines for rapid piece development. This bold capture immediately opens lines, offering black dynamic chances, but demanding precise piece placement to avoid counterplay. Developing the bishop here immediately contests the center and prepares for kingside castling, disrupting black's central influence. Challenging white's central pawn structure immediately, black aims to develop aggressively and seize initiative in the unfolding tactical melee. Recapturing the pawn opens lines, but watch for black's developing pieces coordinating their counterplay. Sacrificing pawnic initiative for piece activity, black skillfully recenters the knight, igniting central control and preparing for further development. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, as castling swiftly aligns the king with a safer haven and prepares the rook for potential central action. Suddenly, the knight trades off, simplifying the central tension and opening lines towards the kings. This maneuver, while resolving immediate pressure, concedes the initiative as black's pawn structure now enjoys more breathing room. White, however, retains excellent development and a clear path for their pieces to become active. Opening the d-file offers white attacking prospects along it and frees the bishop, while black must now address the compromised central pawn structure. Reclaiming central influence, black strategically redirects the knight to a square that pressures white's d-pawn and opens lines for potential piece development, a subtle but crucial shift in the immediate positional struggle. Developing the bishop to control the center and prepare for the queen's rook opens up clear lines for future piece activity, aiming to exploit black's somewhat congested pawn structure. Shattering the central pawn chain, black initiates a tactical exchange, designed to simplify the position and potentially exploit white's slightly awkward bishop placement on e3, creating a complex pawn structure that favors tactical skirmishes over quiet maneuvering. Unearthing a latent threat, white retrieves the queen to a more active central square, eyeing potential attacks on the kingside. This repositioning also prepares for future pawn advancements, potentially restricting black's development. The queen's new perch offers greater influence over the d5 square and could soon become a thorn in black's side. Establishing pawn chains and reinforcing your center is the immediate priority, securing a more robust pawn structure for the middle game. Initiating a strategic redeployment of the knight, the intent here is to fortify the e4 pawn's advance, potentially paving the way for a queenside expansion or reinforcing the central structure. This maneuver also prepares to contest the d4 square more actively, aiming to limit black's central influence and open up avenues for piece coordination. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing for kingside castling, this bishop retreat looks to contest the central diagonal and offer support to the upcoming pawn push. The pawn thrust opens up the f-file for potential future aggression, but it also creates a weakness on the e4 square and potentially exposes the king. Fortifying the kingside with g6 is a sensible defensive maneuver, aimed at preventing white's knight from potentially hopping to f5, while simultaneously preparing to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop. This choice signals black's intention to build a solid pawn structure, aiming for a long-term positional struggle rather than an immediate tactical fireworks display. It's a move that subtly reorganizes the dark squares around the king, potentially creating a safer haven, though it does come with the slight positional concession of weakening the light squares. Fortifying the central pawn structure with c3 creates a more robust pawn chain, aiming to prevent further incursions by black's pieces and potentially liberating the queen's bishop from its cramped position. Unleashing a pawn thrust to seize central territory, black immediately contests the space white has meticulously built, aiming to dislodge the knight on d2 and potentially open lines for their pieces. This bold advance signals an intention to break the pawn chain and create dynamic counterplay, potentially leading to a sharper, more unbalanced position. Opening the d-file with the rook immediately asserts pressure along that critical central corridor, preparing to challenge black's pawn structure and potentially harass the king's defenses once the center opens further. Unleashing a bishop to f5 immediately challenges white's queen and hints at a desire to disrupt the central pawn structure, potentially creating play on the queenside through moves like c4 if the queen retreats obligingly. Shaking up the center, this aggressive queen sortie directly challenges black's pawn structure and forces a decision, creating immediate tactical ripples. Seeking refuge from the immediate storm and preparing a more robust pawn structure is the primary goal here. Trading queens now, a pivotal decision, simplifies the pawn structure for white while subtly opening the d-file for potential future pressure. This maneuver aims to leverage white's slightly more active piece placement, particularly the bishop on e3, and prepare for a more endgame-oriented game where white might possess a slight initiative due to better pawn structure and potential for king's safety. It's a move that prioritizes solidity and avoids immediate complications, suggesting a strategic shift towards exploiting white's material advantage. The reigning king now ventures out, exposing his royal personage to potential checks and creating a more open avenue for his queen to rejoin the fray, which could be vital in the impending material struggle. Repositioning the knight to the rim offers a new avenue of attack, aiming to control the crucial b3 square and potentially disrupt black's queenside structure. Solidifying the queenside pawns and preparing to develop the remaining pieces, black anchors the pawn chain with this timely advance. The rook's forceful occupation of the fifth rank immediately strains black's king's position, forcing a defensive response that will likely involve sacrificing material to escape the menacing pressure. The black monarch's unexpected journey to the center now becomes a serious liability, as white's rook seizes control of the open d-file, threatening to splinter black's already disconnected pawn structure and expose weaknesses around the king. Centralizing the rook on the d-file now aims to exploit the compromised pawn structure around black's king and potentially create attacking opportunities along this open line. Reinforcing the central pawn majority and preparing to contest the open d-file, black initiates a crucial defensive maneuver by bringing the rook into the fray. Opening the central files drastically alters the endgame's dynamics. The rook's return to the central file aims to contest the now open d-file, a crucial battleground as pieces are exchanged and the endgame looms. Initiating a fundamental pawn endgame, this exchange on the d-file strips away crucial pieces, simplifying the board and ushering in a new strategic phase where pawn structure and king activity will dominate. Black finally consolidates their material advantage, exchanging off the last of white's active pieces and ushering in a more simplified endgame where their extra pawn should become a decisive factor. Transferring the monarch to safety amidst the remaining tension is the primary objective, establishing a more secure base of operations for the coming exchanges and potential pawn advances. The pawn push f6 cracks open the kingside further, creating dynamic potential but also a potential weakness around the monarch. While it seeks to challenge white's central pawn structure and possibly open a path for the bishop, it demands careful calculation regarding the safety of the black king. Consider the long-term consequences of this pawn structure. Has it weakened the g7 square too much, or is it a necessary step to activate black's pieces? Capturing the pawn opens a crucial diagonal for white's remaining minor piece, aiming to exploit the exposed king and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The bishop now occupies a central outpost, eyeing the weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially influencing the h4-d8 diagonal for future maneuverings. Reclaiming the open d-file with the knight, white aims to mobilize its pieces towards active squares, especially eyeing the vulnerable f6 bishop. The black monarch, having survived an early skirmish on the queenside, now ventures towards the center, aiming to participate actively in the unfolding endgame. This aggressive positioning of the king, while bold, potentially exposes it to unforeseen threats from the remaining white pieces, particularly the knight, and the rooks that might yet find advantageous squares. Consider the potential interplay of the knight on d2 and the king's current location. Can white exploit this by opening lines or creating immediate tactical opportunities? The white monarch steps out to embrace the battlefield, a bold maneuver that could either solidify control or expose vulnerabilities as the endgame unfurls. A curious maneuver, placing the bishop on the advanced square, where it appears to be a tempting target, yet it might disrupt white's unified pawn structure and pressure the c3 square. Pawns advance to fortify the king's sanctuary, creating a defensive shield as the endgame looms. Suddenly, a desperate check. The black bishop, exiled to the queenside, makes a last-ditch effort to disrupt white's advancing pawn storm, and more importantly, to gain a tempo. However, this bold foray exposes the black king to further danger as white's monarch now boasts a much clearer path to activity, while the black king remains somewhat rooted and vulnerable in the center. Relocating the monarch to a more secure corner, a tactical retreat from immediate threats while surveying the unfolding endgame battleground. Carving out a more active post for that bishop, aiming to untangle the queenside and potentially initiate pawn pushes on the flank. Unlocking the f-file, white immediately injects dynamism into this already sharp middle game. This pawn thrust is more than just territorial expansion. It's a strategic declaration aiming to pry open lines towards black's king and exploit the potential weakness of the d5 pawn. Embracing the chaos, black rips open the g-file, a bold maneuver gambling on the king's sudden exposure, forcing white into defensive calculations. Capturing that pawn opens the g-file, offering immediate dynamic possibilities for white's king, while simultaneously creating a protected passed pawn on the f-file that demands black's attention. The pawn push aims to gain space on the queenside, potentially creating a passed pawn later, but it weakens the pawn structure and ignores the immediate threat to the f5 pawn. Opening up the a-file now grants white increased activity on the queenside, potentially forcing black's king further into a passive position while preparing to support a pawn advance. Unlocking the queenside majority, this pawn thrust aims to create a dangerous passed pawn on the b-file, a crucial endgame objective. Advancing the kingside pawn is a bold attempt to expand space and potentially create a passed pawn, but it also opens the h-file and could leave the white king exposed. Pushing that b-pawn is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for your rook on the queenside, potentially creating immediate counterplay. The bishop's retreat to the g5 square, far from seeming passive, creates an immediate bind on black's queenside pawns and subtly prepares for further advances on the kingside. It leverages the diagonal's reach, forcing black to consider awkward pawn structures or the exposure of their king. This maneuver aims to constrict black's development and create weaknesses that white can exploit in the coming exchanges. A surprising surge of energy, forcing the white king to abandon its protected perch. This counterattack throws a wrench into white's carefully constructed pawn chain on the kingside, exposing critical squares and demanding an immediate, precise response to prevent further penetration. Stepping back from the immediate tactical skirmish, the king prioritizes safety, seeking refuge on a more protected square as the pawn structure unravels. Opening a pathway for your bishop to become active on the queenside seems the primary goal, though it surrenders the central pawns and grants white an open file. Opening the b-file now presents white with a doubled pawn structure, a potential long-term weakness, yet it simultaneously grants the rook immediate access to an open highway, aiming to pressure black's vulnerable queenside pawn majority. Securing that bishop on c3, you're aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create a bit of chaos, but be wary of leaving your own king exposed, as white's king might prove surprisingly mobile in this simplified scenario. The monarch's repositioning signals an immediate threat to the isolated pawn on a4, forcing black to address its defense. The bishop retreats to a seemingly safer square, but it relinquishes its crucial outpost on the c-file, allowing white's king to solidify its central position and prepare for further advancements. Unlocking the pawn chain with f6 is a bold gambit, forcing a critical decision for black and immediately disrupting the pawn structure around the enemy king. The ensuing chaos could unravel the defensive fabric if black falters. Bringing the monarch into the fray, this king move aims to secure the pawn chain and prepare for potential exchanges, though it exposes the king to the centralized bishop. Reinforcing the knight's central presence opens up possibilities for a multi-pronged attack on black's compromised kingside pawns and creates a formidable outpost for white's piece. The black bishop, after its daring dance across the board, now forces the white king into a cramped position, a direct consequence of the earlier pawn push that opened up lines. Navigating the fractured pawn structure, the king's redeployment to f4 aims to solidify its central presence and offer protection to the advancing f-pawn, preparing for further territorial gains amidst the chaotic pawn exchanges. The king, now a nomad on the open plain, finds temporary respite from the oncoming storm, forcing white's knight to reposition and buy precious time. The white king, having endured a circuitous route, now occupies a deceptively central square, aiming to anchor the advancing pawns while simultaneously defending the knight. The king, now exposed on the light squares due to the loss of the bishop pair, finds itself the target of a relentless pawn storm, a consequence of abandoning its central safe haven. The white king, now unchained from its defensive duties, steps boldly onto the central stage, initiating a decisive endgame thrust to exploit black's exposed monarch. The rook's relocation to b2 is a fascinating strategic gamble, aiming to reignite activity from a seemingly passive square, but it risks leaving the bishop vulnerable to white's encroaching pawns and potentially sacrificing tempo if white can effectively blockade. Reclaiming the open file, the bishop now eyes the vulnerable pawn chain. Snatching the pawn on a3 is a bold, albeit risky, attempt to gain material, but it leaves black's king exposed and forfeits a critical tempo that could be used for more constructive maneuvering. The bishop now occupies the critical c3 square, a move that fundamentally alters the pawn structure and introduces new tactical possibilities. This placement challenges the coordination of black's doubled pawns on the queenside, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited in the ensuing endgame. It also opens a diagonal for white's king to potentially join the action later. The bishop's retreat to c1 offers a brief respite, attempting to regroup the forces and protect the weak pawns, but it ultimately surrenders valuable tempo and leaves the b2 pawn completely undefended, inviting further infiltration by white's rook and knight. Pushing that pawn now forces the black bishop into a passive, defensive role, as its diagonal is completely blocked, while simultaneously advancing white's own promotion threat and restricting black's king's options. The black king, having voluntarily marched into the fray, now faces the grim reality of its exposed position. Its final journey to safety is blocked by a determined pawn and an active bishop, making survival a dire prospect. The white king decisively marches forward, a bold assertion of control in the now open center, seeking to exploit the weakened dark squares around the black monarch. The pawn's advance opens a path to promotion, creating immediate pressure on white's weakened king and forcing a response that will likely compromise white's pawn structure further. Capturing the pawn with the king seals the fate of black's pieces trapped on the queenside, creating a passed pawn of immense importance. The bishop, previously a thorn in white's side, now finds itself in a precarious position, facing an unavoidable capture by the pawn. Bringing the monarch to a more active central square to support the pawn's advance and limit the enemy bishop's scope. The black king, having ventured to the edge of the board, now faces an uphill battle to find safety as white's pawn presses forward. Consolidating the kingside pawn majority while simultaneously preparing to activate the rook on the open file represents a sound, albeit passive, repositioning strategy. Securing that last pawn sacrifice opens up the file for the king's triumphant march towards the queenside majority, a classic endgame strategy to force promotion. The king's active participation in clearing out these passed pawns is crucial. It marches forward to claim a pawn and secure a favorable pawn structure. The black king, despite its early coronation, now finds itself exposed in the center of the board, a tempting target for the advancing white pawns. Bringing the king into the fray activates your monarch for the final push, aiming to escort the passed pawn and coordinate its advance with the remaining pieces. Capturing the pawn, you're sacrificing any hope of a drawing margin and heading straight into a potentially lost king and pawn endgame where white's passed pawn on f7 will prove decisive.